Thank you very much, Mrs. Main, and it's a pleasure to serve under you, I think, for the first time since I've been here. Before I start, I'd particularly like to thank the House of Commons Library, who have provided me with advice and information as background for this debate, and also the Ealing Law Centre. As an elected councillor for 25 years before coming to this place, I know how important good quality early professional help is in preventing so many issues, but particularly in preventing homelessness, indebtedness and other related problems. And I know how important early advice is too to prevent issues escalating and causing stress to families and cost to the public purse. The sooner, the earlier, the better and the cheaper. As for a background, Mrs. Main, legal aid was withdrawn for housing advice by the government in 2012-13. Yet this was at a time when we saw the beginning of escalating problems that were already there, but more and more people having problems trying to keep their home and to keep their home safe and warm. Firstly, the acute shortage of social housing through the right to buy and the ending of government funding for new council and other social rent housing, and this at a time when demand for housing was increasing. The related escalation of private sector rents beyond the means of average wage earners, let alone those on low and minimum wages. In my constituency, rents are 3 to 4 times in the private sector that of council rents. Then there's the related use of one-term tenancies by landlords, because they can afford to get possession and then rent to someone else able to pay a higher rent in the inflated West London housing market. The escalation of 0 hours and low-paid self-employment is also affecting the ability of many people on low incomes to pay their rents. And then for those, some of whom are working, some of whom are not working, the cutbacks and changes in the many benefits and tax credits mean there is less to live on for many. And finally, at this point, the draconian universal credit rules, which apart from providing less to live on than legacy benefits, they expect a claimant to wait for 5 weeks with no money at all. And in my constituency, that means 5 weeks rent payments can be anything up to £2,000 for a family. So it's hardly surprising that more people need more help with housing and debt, and also how landlords can get away with providing more substandard private sector housing, where repairs need catching early before they make homes dangerous. MPs and councillors do offer advice, but too often it's to underfunded organisations. Many advisors may not be legally qualified, very willing and able, but often one needs, even at an early advice stage, legally qualified people in these advice services. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'd like to congratulate her on securing this important debate. Does she agree with me that the serious decline in providers of housing legal aid, so for example in my area in Barnsley there's only 2, is simply insufficient, and it leaves those most in need isolated and often without the help they need?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and there are parts of the country with no appropriate legal advice services, and for rural areas to have to travel tens of miles when you're already on a low income to then find appropriate advice is shocking. Honourable
Lady for giving way, and I congratulate her in achieving this, securing this debate. North West Wales also has only one provider of housing legal aid for a population of over 300,000 people. We've already mentioned the issues regarding travel, but can we also raise the matter that a single provider firm may well not have the capacity to deal with the needs of all potential clients, and may well in that case actually have to make a list of people based on their needs, and some people in urgent help are not being reached. And secondly, that single provider may also...
It's not firstly and secondly, there's one intervention. Ruth Cadbury.
Yes, the Honourable Lady is absolutely correct. And the other problem with even if there is only one legal aid provider, it may be that the other party to a dispute is also gone to that provider, and then there are problems because who can advise the person seeking help and advice?
And congratulate her on securing this debate. But even where you've got a provider who can provide legal advice like CAB and other groups, it's to cut back to their benefits, as it were, or their financial situations. They make it, they throw it all on us then to try and help the people out, as the point you made earlier.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right as well, because the cutbacks to local authorities, the cutbacks to other parts of the public sector have fallen on the voluntary sector that so often has been the provider of good, the alternative provider of good quality help and support to people needing that professional good quality advice and also consistent advice. In my own area, there is currently no law centre. When I was lead member in 2010 in Hounslow, we did increase the funding for the CAB, but the demand on the local CAB has well escalated beyond that. The philanthropic centre, the foundations and Big Lottery and so on are often left to pick up the pieces, but the pressures on their funding is getting greater and greater. So overall, there is less good quality professional help and advice available in the sector, and I do urge the government to address this issue as part of the review that I'll go on to in a moment. And I'll go back to where I was, that, as I say, MPs and councillors are not professional legal advisors. And at best, we should be signposting, we should be providing basic advice, but we don't have the capacity or skills to provide the detailed advice that people need, even at the early stages of problems arising. I'm going to give a couple of examples that Vicky Fuchs at the Ealing Law Centre provided me with. These are people who, much of the time, were not eligible for housing legal aid. And in all cases, the welfare benefits work that was done under grant funding and not legal aid. So, firstly, a constituent was in substantial rent arrears due to universal credit issues. Her tenancy was in joint names of her and her partner. However, she'd been abused by her partner, which then led to them separating and her partner moving out. Universal credit wouldn't pay her full rent due to the tenancy being in both names. She was given time to transfer the tenancy into her name and resolve the universal credit issues. The advisor worked with her and managed to resolve the matter and retrieve about £5,000 in universal housing payments. She kept her home at substantial cost to the public sector, of course, but that was funded, as I say, not through legal aid, when I believe it should have been. Another, the constituent was in arrears of over £2,500 following the stoppage of her ESA and housing benefit. She had 4 children aged between 11 and 19. She suffered from depression, anxiety and physical problems as well. Her housing benefits had been cancelled due to the required information not being supplied. The caseworker worked with her and her husband to claim backdated housing benefit, liaised with the council and worked with the husband to answer all of the council's questions and provide required evidence. The hearings were adjourned until the ESA and housing benefit issues could be resolved. The ESA decision was appealed and the decision was overturned, meaning she eventually got a backdated payment of ESA and £4,000 housing benefit being paid into her rent account. She kept her home, but of course, she was a council tenant. If she had been a private sector tenant, that landlord would not have waited for her income situation to be resolved. So a little bit about the work of the Ealing Law Centre done by a crisis navigator. It's a big lottery-funded Help Through Crisis project. It's essential. This is Vicky Fuchs from the Law Centre saying, this work is essential and is not being funded by legal aid as it stands at the moment. A lot of problems that they come across arise from insecure work, variable hours, zero hours contracts, and these then impact benefits and rent arrears as a result. If clients are evicted, if they're housed by the local authority, then the temporary accommodation rent is so high and housing benefit is being paid for this. And in my area, housing benefit caps are well below the rent, even for poor quality private sector housing in West London. Vicky finally says it really would make sense to provide benefit support at an early stage. So, Mrs Main, the Legal Aid and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012, I'll now refer to it as LASPO, made fundamental changes to the eligibility for legal aid. Under LASPO, applicants must pass 3 basic tests, must be within the scope of the legal aid scheme. There's a means test to pass, a financial means test to pass, and a merits test looking at the applicant's chance of success in the case and the cost-benefit analysis of providing legal aid funding. What is included within the scope of legal aid are homelessness, allocations, accommodation for asylum seekers, repossession of a rented home, but only when the loss of the home is imminent and the landlord has sought an order for possession. Lawful and unlawful eviction from the home, injunctions relating to harassment, antisocial behaviour cases in the county court, and disrepair, but again only when there's a serious risk of harm to the health or safety of the occupiers, and judicial review. Areas which are no longer eligible for legal aid since LASPO are rent and mortgage arrears that may ultimately result in possession proceedings, early stage disputes between landlords and tenants. Yes.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. You mentioned early legal advice. And of course, one of the recommendations from the BAT Commission is that early legal advice can help save money in the long run. The Law Society estimate that early legal advice and housing benefit claims would be between 1.7 to 2 million each year. But the costs through avoidable evictions are often far greater for individuals, councils and for the NHS.
Can I say that there is plenty of opportunities. Does everybody sit down? There's plenty of opportunities to speak, but these are not interventions when they are of such length. Please form a question quickly to the Honourable Lady.
Does my honourable friend agree that reintroducing early legal advice would help to solve the housing crisis?
Absolutely, and my honourable friend anticipates what I'm going to come on to in a minute. Going back to what's no longer eligible, as well as early stage disputes between landlords and tenants no longer being eligible, housing benefit advice, which of course is particularly worrying, as I've already referred to the many changes of the benefit system, and transferring onto universal credit, as I say, no payment for up to 5 weeks. That's a lot of money, a lot of heartache, as I say, particularly for those tenants in the private sector where their landlords aren't prepared to wait until these things are resolved. But even for tenants who are housing association or council tenants, who I kind of assure, look, don't worry, the council will not evict you on this basis. But it's still that stress and that worry that people don't need. And many people go and borrow money that they can little afford to pay back from friends, relatives and from payday lenders. And you know, it causes massive problems. So since LASPO was introduced in 2012-13, there's been a 58% fall in legal help for housing cases in England and Wales, from just over 85,000 per annum to just over 35,500 per annum. LASPO has caused a critical decline in the numbers of housing legal aid providers, as we've already mentioned, from 646 in the year before LASPO to 427. And the Law Society in July 2016 found that a third of legal aid areas have just one solicitor providing specialised housing advice through legal aid. And areas such as Surrey, Shropshire and Suffolk had no legal aid provider specialising in housing. That is shocking, Mrs Main. So a review of LASPO in respect of legal aid for housing advice and aid is urgently needed. But I particularly now want to focus on the area my honourable friend has just raised with me, is that of the early legal advice. Without early legal advice, a problem can escalate, which costs the tenant stress and possibly, of course, the loss of their home. That causes knock-on costs for the public purse, poor health, homelessness and debt. And I've met several families in my surgery and in my work as an MP outside the surgery who didn't seek early advice. They left their home when the landlord asked them to, and they didn't wait for the court order, let alone the bailiffs. And as a result, they were deemed intentionally homeless. So the housing department were able to discharge their duty to house them. Mrs Main, how many people actually know the ins and outs of housing law to know that to know what I know, which is wait until the bailiffs arrive. Most people want to do the right thing. They feel scared by their landlords. They think they can sofa surf for a while and sort something out. Reality isn't like that, as I say, particularly in the very high-cost areas of West London that I represent. As a result, as I say, deemed intentionally homeless, so the Housing Department were able to discharge their duty to house them. Those that have children, under the Children's Act, quite rightly, social services has to find them a home. That's yet more work and cost for already overstretched social workers, who of course are not housing specialists, and also that means the social services are also competing for the small amount of private sector accommodation that the Housing Department is looking for temporary accommodation, plus all those people who come to live and work in London also looking for accommodation. Since LASPO, legal advice is no longer available for disrepair until it affects the tenant's health, nor for possible eviction unless a possession notice has actually been granted. In November 2017, the Law Society called for legal aid to be reintroduced for early advice in family and housing law, saying, quote, "We all know that if you catch a problem early, you're more likely to stop it getting worse," unquote. The Law Society research showed that on average, 1 in 4 people who receive early professional legal advice had resolved their problem within 3 to 4 months. But for those that didn't get any legal advice, it wasn't until 9 months after the issue first occurred that 1 in 4 had resolved their issue. And those getting no early advice were 20% less likely on average to ever have their problem resolved. The Law Society, in doing their report, wasn't angling for more work for their members. In fact, probably the opposite, as they recognise that for legal problems, like so much in life, are easier dealt with and cheaper if dealt with early on. The Law Society estimate that restoring advice to the legal aid system for housing benefit alone could be done for about £2 million a year, based on the cost of pre-LASPO advice for housing benefits. They also suggest that restoration of early advice on mortgage arrears, which is outside of the remit of legal aid now, but that advice could prevent escalative arrears and further costs of possession proceedings. And by the way, reduce some of the additional costs arising from legal aid cuts. Now, I'm really pleased that the Labour Party in April announced its new policy to restore legal advice in all housing cases. And this came from one of the recommendations of the Justice Commission, chaired by Lord Bark, and which was established by the member for Islington North when he became leader of the Labour Party, one of the first things he did in that role. The Bark report estimates that restoring legal advice funded by legal aid could help up to 50,000 households per year to enforce their housing rights. By responding to Labour's announcement and starting to provide funding for early professional legal advice for housing matters, the government would really be making a difference to so many people in our constituencies. It would almost certainly mean a lower volume of cases going to court, as they could be resolved earlier, with wider benefits and savings, including health savings caused by significant disrepair issues, plus the costs of paying high-cost temporary housing benefit for high-cost temporary housing. Fewer people would become homeless, fewer leaving rent arrears and mortgage debts unaddressed. Chair, everyone should have the right to a safe and decent home. So I'm asking that the government take the opportunity of the review of LASPO announced last October to recommend returning to legal aid the ability to obtain legal advice for housing matters and to also have a fundamental review of legal aid as it applies to housing issues. I look hopefully to the answer the Minister gave to my colleague, the member for Sheffield Central, on the 23rd of January this year on this very issue. Thank you.